Was better. And now, Francis, can you hear me in the back?
Yes, I can hear you.
Excellent, because we don't actually have a microphone. There are seats in front, and you are allowed to take the front seats, so please don't be shy. I am going to sit down, but I'm just standing up to capture your attention, that's all. So, the first thing to say is a big welcome to all the people who have come from India, the three of them, but of course especially to Srijato, and I will introduce Srijato in a minute. But we wanted to start by, as always, saying a word of thanks to the Noongar people on whose land we stand. The land was never ceded. So in a sense, we stand on stolen land, but in another sense, we hope that we have the blessings of their elders, past and present. Now, when I ask for the blessings of Noongar elders, past and present, when I do that in English, there is always a little bit of weirdness about it, because in the Western context, we don't start every ceremony by asking for the blessing of elders. But it rings absolutely okay for a Bengali, doesn't it?
Yes.
Because we also, always, on every occasion, keep asking for the blessings of our ancestors past and present. So, now for the introductions. My name is Krishna. Most of you, I think, I know, but if you don't know me, it's very easy to remember. It's like Hare Rama, Hare Krishna, that kind of Krishna. Because if I say my name in English, Krishna Sen, at the end of the session, somebody will always say, "Hello, Christensen." It's definitely not Christensen. And one of the traditions that Caroline Wood, who is the absent host of this meeting. Caroline is the director of the Centre for Stories. One of the things that Caroline always insists on when we do things that are readings is to allow for some space for people to hear that language. Mm-hmm. So I am very privileged because I can read both Robbie's work and Srijato's in the language in which you write. I have also got, I think you'll be very envious. I can actually read poetry in 5 languages. No. Aren't I the luckiest girl in the world?
Yes,
okay.
yeah.
So most of us, of course, when we grow up in India, many of us read poetry in 2 or 3 different languages. Srijato is no exception. How to introduce Srijato has been a little bit of a problem for me, so I'm going to come back to him. But I wanted to talk about Robbie first, because Robbie really doesn't need any introduction in this crowd. Robbie has Dr. Robert Wood has played a whole lot of roles, both within PEN International. He was the previous chair of PEN International in Perth. But also at the Centre for Stories, and he has started a whole range of projects and driven them to success, which are absolutely related to what we might call this connecting point between cultures and languages. And his latest venture, I think, is the Portside Review. I was hoping to hand some copies of it around, but Robbie tells me it is entirely, like all modern writing ventures, it is entirely online. So we will make links available to anybody who wishes to have those. So the hosts for this afternoon are, of course, PEN International Perth, and I'm here in my role as the current chair of PEN Perth. And Robbie's been, I think that will have to do for introduction to Robbie, because many people here know more about Robbie than I do. Srijato, I was thinking of an apt way to introduce him. Mm-hmm. I couldn't find one, but that is partly because I didn't want to say he's not just a poet, because just a poet, wow, poet, that's a whole lot. You can't say he isn't just a poet. But he is a writer in many genres. He's also a filmmaker and a performer. And it occurred to me that perhaps One way of describing him would be to say he has something of the status of, say, Nick Cave, who is a poet and a performer. But because Srijato writes in a language that is not an imperialist language, it is not a minority language either. Bengali is the 5th largest spoken language in the world. There are 300 million people?
Right.
Something like that who speak the language. So it is no minority language, but it's not an imperialist language. So Srijato is extremely important within the context in which he operates. He's probably his generation's finest poet, but what do I know about poetry? I shouldn't make those judgments. There are many fine poets, but I'm going to put him on the spot now by trying to get him to explain something of the role of poetry within the context of Bengali language and culture, and I'll tell you why. Srijato has written, 20 volumes of poems, am I correct, approximately?
Yeah.
And they sell in what I think we could only regard as eye-watering numbers in this community. It is not surprising for him to sell 10 or 12,000 copies the moment a book is published. So he's a mega figure, but it has something to do also with the role of poetry in that community.
Right.
So talk to us about that. What is poetry? Do you think you could take the cap off?
I didn't want to expose my,
because that gives you authority.
First, let me thank you. Let me thank Center for Stories and PEN International for having me, and thanks to you all, you wonderful crowd that you have gathered for us, gathered for poetry, because poetry is a minority, I think, all over the world, be it in what language. And if, coming to the language, please pardon my English, it's terrible, and I know that. Coming to Krishna, this question, I think in Bengal, poetry really plays a great role, and it has always played a great role because it's a household art. You go to any house in Bengal, almost any house which has a minimum level of education in them, you have a bookcase and you have books of poetry, and you will find one man or one woman in the family who writes poetry. He or she might not publish it, he or she might have a secret diary, but every other guy or every other girl in Kolkata or Bengal is writing poetry. Whatever it may be like, it's not easy to judge, and I am not a judge here. But because Bengal has always produced the best of poets amongst our country. I'm not demeaning any other state, any other language, but it has started long back than Tagore, and we had Charjapad, all the shlokas written in poem. So all our stories are always been written in poetry, be it the Purans, be it the epics, the Ramayana, the Mahabharata. We read it in poetry, a form of poetry. So poetry has always been a huge influencer throughout Bengal.
I have a question from this.
Yeah, sure.
So what did you read growing up? What was in your household conversation? What books, what were you reading?
That's an interesting question. I mostly Bengali, and definitely Rabindranath Tagore. Reading him is a mandate in every middle class household in Bengal. So we had to read him. But when we were growing up, going to school, we had the exposure to every other poet, pre and post Rabindranath, be it Jivanananda Das, be it Sudhin Datta Shankha, or be it Michael or Sukumar Roy in that sense. So we had...
So the names that Srijato is mentioning are so common to us, we don't think of explaining them, but he's covering a period of approximately 100 years before Tagore gets his Nobel Prize.
Yeah, so thank you. So we had a bouquet of poets in front of us whom we can read. So when I were in college, I had a huge collection of poetry books. I used to save money from my pocket money, and I used to go to the shops and buy some books, be it second hand or first hand. Mostly second hand, because first hand wasn't very affordable. And there were no guide. There were no easy guide or guidance that what you should read and what not. So I read what I could grab off. So right now I'm reading a poet in Bengal who I haven't read in my 48 years. So it's so huge, the catalogue of Bengali poetry, that a man can read till he lives and cannot finish it. So I'm trying to do that.
Can I ask you the same question? One, what did you read? And two, is the marginality of the poet in Australia actually a good thing to have?
I think Srijato's comment that poetry is a marginal or minoritized activity in any language is true. And if you think of Australia as the frame, it's like that's 25 million as opposed to Bengali as 300 million. And not every poet working on the continent works in English, so that's like a national language, but not everyone works in English. And that can be both First Nation languages in traditional or contemporary forms, through to diasporic and immigrant languages as well. In terms of my kind of reading diet or kind of growing up, I grew up in the suburbs 15 minutes away from here in a kind of cross-cultural household. And my mother's parents were born in Kerala. She herself was born in Singapore, and then I was born in Australia, which is a kind of 20th century story of empire as well as migration. My father's family migrated from Scotland in the 20th century to Australia. And I think for me, of course, Tagore exists in the household because of the Indian diaspora connection to middle class reading, which is like Nobel Prize winners. Yeah. So he exists as in the teen moment where you're searching for things and have no guide except for this kind of marketed prize culture. So that also exists alongside Toni Morrison and Gabriel Garcia Marquez, but also Dario Fo because of what that means. And also I think for me growing up, I also had a kind of Scottish inheritance. So my father often will read Robbie Burns at weddings, funerals, parties, anything. So there's that, and you can ask him afterwards because he's in the audience. So I think that exists too in my kind of cultural upbringing. But then also kind of coming of age in suburban Perth in the 80s and 90s, at school I am reading Gwen Harwood and I am reading John Kinsella, and you are reading a whole host of kind of local poets that might have resonance for people. And so I think for me that was a kind of inheritance until kind of that college moment where you are just spending indiscriminate amounts of money that pocket money, on books. Always secondhand. Always secondhand. Yeah, that's right.
I was going to say that there are a number of senior kind of poetry figures in the room, and Srijato had insisted that this was to be an adda, and adda can be exactly translated into English as yarning, which means really, even though the setting is a bit hierarchical, please, there are lots of people who have more interesting questions than I might be able to think of, though, Robbie, and you can obviously talk to each other. So please interrupt whenever you want to. Robbie, did you have something else to say, or shall I keep going?
Go.
Okay. So it's kind of interesting. It's a marginalised space, but it is also a representative space in some ways. So I don't know enough about the Australian tradition, but some of you have heard PEN International in Perth talk about V.V. Rao, who is currently in prison. He's been released on kind of sick leave from prison. And there is one poem of his which I have read many times where he says, in a sense, he says, I'm the voice of the people. I am the revolution. Of course, Bangla has a huge tradition of I am the revolution, Bolobi, Bolun, not the Wawashir, etc. Indonesian, again, there are a couple of Indonesian friends at the back. Indonesian, again, has a huge tradition of, or not a huge tradition, I shouldn't say, but a moment where the poet takes, in the middle of nationalism, where the poet takes on this role of representativeness. Beta Pati Rajawani. Does anybody know any more lines of that poem? No, they don't. They're too young. So you know, this kind of association with the rest. In one way, they're marginalised. In another way, they speak for the people and with the people. So, and I'm going to bring you to the contemporary politics in a minute. So, answer this one carefully.
I think it's really interesting to see that poetry, as you say, that it's really marginal, but it's really popular, and it can influence anyone in a moment. So as we as a tribe or as a community, we are so much exposed to poetry, its culture, its heritage. A two-liner poem can move us any moment. So it's always when the atrocities take place, or we are not happy with something happening around us, we use poetry as our weapons. Be it written by the poems from the other ages, or we try to contribute in those lines that we should write poems on what is going around us. And people readily react, or they readily connect to it.
So you speak to power in one sense, but in your case, experience has been, I don't know how much of this you want to talk about publicly, but in your case over the last couple of days, and this is of very immediate interest to PEN International. I was going to get to this later, but I'm going to get to this first, because I think just in the last few days you have had this experience that you cannot just write as a poet and be protected because you're a poet.
Right.
So in a sense, those who you write against have a reaction. Sorry.
I kind of jump in there. I think one of the things that I've noticed, my poetic consciousness was formed in a lot of ways, like outside of Australia when I was travelling and moving around and living in other places. But also what I've noticed here is that, and something I dearly love about the poetry as a community, is it's highly participatory, right? Like poets organise their own readings. Poets are the editors of poetry books. Poets do their own advertising. Poets have a different mechanism to labour. So being a poet is not only about being the voice, but it is about being the worker in the community that is poetry, right? And so you can be involved in poetry for a very long time and never publish a poem or never have a book come out. And that's what I really love about it. It is, and that is its kind of like radical democratic possibility here, particularly when people very rarely sell 10,000 books. And so it's like a participatory activity, which is not to say it's amateur or anything like that. And I like that sensibility about it. It's like there's a do-it-yourself culture that I think is really empowering for people as people, of which poetry is the medium. And that kind of means there is a politics to it as well. Not for everyone, you have people who have different capital P political views, but it is a community activity that is very different from things that have like a big market attached. It's not like the novel where there's like critics who write on novels and they're like, I'm a novel critic, and they occupy institutional power or they have market power or something like that. For the most part, there's always exceptions, but I think that is also it's part of the participatory quality is very unique.
And maybe it has your story about what you wrote and why the reaction from...
I have been facing atrocities since last 7 or 10 years because I have written some poems which I thought was right. But a large amount of people were very annoyed about all those, and they even filed cases against me. They reported me to the police, and I have 12 or 13 cases all over the country against me because of writing a few poems. And 5 years back I was reading in a hall in a hotel banquet in Assam, and a few people came, 300 or 400 people. And
But that's very small in the context of the population. It's marginal in the context of that population. It's not a very big crowd.
But they,
It's the smallest wedding you can have.
Yeah,
Actually,
exactly. Exactly. It's a very small crowd.
And you're very lucky if you can have 300 plates of dinner. But
Yeah.
that doesn't happen really. So they came and they started asking me, why did you write this poem? Explain it to us. So I told them that I think poetry is my medium of protest, as it's my medium of expression, and protest is one form of expression too. So I try to protest in my own way. So if there's freedom of speech, and if this is a democratic country, a man should be allowed to write. So they wanted me to have outside of the hotel, to have a settlement which is not very emotional, which is physical. And I had to be escorted to a hotel and get, bolted to Kolkata, and I had a bodyguard with a pistol for 2 years because people were after me. So things happen, but this is not new. If you look at Lorca to V.V. Rao, the same thing. Whenever you question power, I think power always power is afraid of poets. I don't know why. Poets are nothing. They are. But I must remember that Plato once said that there is no place for a poet in a perfect state. So he was a real visionary to say that, because I think today it's more than a truth, because I have faced a lot and I'm still facing it. But I think freedom of speech is like a unicorn, which it's there, but it's not there really. So, but we can't help writing, because that's what we do. And if we, cut off the protest part and we writing about birds, we writing about loving you, writing about everything, and we shutting down our eyes whenever things are happening around us, that's not done, I think. So I'm trying to go on, to write on, and facing these things. I think it gets me growing. I really learn from these incidents. Those are not very sweet or not very memorable, but harsh memories. But I keep on learning from them.
Just one very political question, and then I'll go back to your readings, because I think it's time we heard from both of you as poets. Is the situation, and I'm sure this is in the minds of my Australian friends, does the situation in India under Modi seem to you that life for poets is going to get more difficult because you don't any longer have certain spaces that are permissible to you?
It's rather tighter, or we are very cornered, and there's barely any freedom of speech for the poets, exactly. But freedom of speech, when you are taking the side of the rulers, you have all the freedom of speech. It always has been like this. I think Tagore has faced a lot. He was not in social media, but he got trolled regularly. So in today's light, we have social media, and people's emotions are so fragile, they get hurt very easily. You write a line and all the system collapses down. What is this? You mean if your religion is so fragile that one line can hurt it or break it, that's not your religion then. It should be very powerful to hold everything within it. So I think social media has done a lot of harm as well, but social media has given us the power to connect immediately to the entire world with what I think today. And in today's context, it's very tough to question power in any part, and to be free and to be very successful, and
Yeah, just on this, on this too. I think when you do live in quote unquote a liberal democracy, the like cop is in your head more often, right? Like the cop is in your head in a place like Perth. But then you feel that the kind of political amnesia or the political things we don't talk about have bipartisan support. So you think about that in relation to like Perth, where it's just like every skyscraper is a mining skyscraper.
Yeah, that's right.
And like the kind of wheel has turned on the fossil fuels conversation, but it hasn't necessarily turned for the state government. And I don't say that as someone who like is like a party politically aligned. But then you also think about the other things, which is like the ongoing overrepresentation of Aboriginal people in incarceration, or what that means for language. And there's like those are systemic and structural issues. But when it comes to freedom of expression, you know, there are crackdowns on protest here. There are those kind of things. It's not necessarily life or death, or journalists being shot in the street like Gary Lankesh or what have you in India. Right. So that the pitched intensity of it might be different. But I think in that way, like the cop lives in your head, and the point of the poet is to see that the cop in the head, right? Because the poetry happens in your head, and it is participatory, but it's also private. That becomes public. You know, the journals of every household in Bengal become poetic, and that's the kind of medium which we happen in.
I'm going to ask you both to read. I'm going to start with Robbie, and then I'm going to get into this question about you point out that we can now talk to the world, because I think poets also, there may be some limitations to how poets talk to the world. But Robbie, if you go first, and then Pranay will read the Hindi translation. Okay. Robbie's had one whole volume of poems translated into Hindi. Yeah. And this is an interesting one. We'll go into this issue of translation.
No worries. So I can stand up and read this. This is called Reggae, which is a place on Wadandi country. This is part of the Noongar Nation, a kind of separate area as well to the south. And it was published in New Delhi by Red River Press, with Hindi translations done by someone there. They've also published the second book, and they're also doing 8 collections of first books of poetry from people in this city, and that's partly about maintaining that cross-cultural connection and also just expanding the publishing possibilities here. So I'll read the first poem in this book. We're carrots. We're carrots and cabbages and ships, hauled over sand and sound, where they remarked that the colour was always green somehow, and the mushrooms were never found, where the twilight was molasses because we lost our matches. That was where they came to. That was where the stockmen rescued, and we knew somehow that their bones and wings would be laid there when the world found out.
जहाँ गाजर और गोभी और जहाज रेत और आवाज पे उतरते थे, जहाँ उन्होंने तबसरा किया कि रंग हमेशा हरा था किसी वजह से, और मशरूम कभी खोजे नहीं मिले, जहाँ शीरा थी शाम क्योंकि खो चुके थे हम माचीस की तीलियां, कुछ ऐसी जगह पर वे आ पहुंचे और मालूम था हमें किसी वजह से कि इसी जगह दफनाई जाएंगे उनके पंख और हड्डियां, जब दुनिया को चलेगा पता.
Srijato, we are going to get into this whole question of translation here. The whole word stockman has been left out of the translation, and there's a reason for it, I think. It's quite a clever translation. What do you want to read?
I want to read from a book called Mustaq Hussein's Darbari, which is very controversial again, because I made my readers furious by writing these poems, and most of them told me that we will stop buying your books because this is a harsh language you're writing in. What has happened to your pen? You usually write the romantic poems and poems on rain and poems on birds and all. What is this? This is bullshit. I'm sorry for that.
Sorry for French.
Yeah. So it's a whole lot of 62 or 63 poems with a very harsh Bengali language. And Aruna Sinha, my friend, has translated this into English. So I'll read out a poem from this, and Balarko
And
is
Balarko
here.
will read
Right.
thank you.
স্যানিটারি প্যাড ছাড়াই ম্যারাথন দৌড়চ্ছে মেয়েটা। হেভি পিরিয়ডস চলছে তখন তার, সেই নিয়েই দৌড়চ্ছে মাইলের পর মাইল। দৌড়চ্ছে হাঁপাতে হাঁপাতে হাসি মুখে, আর তার দুপায়ের ফাঁক দেখতে দেখতে ভিজে উঠছে রক্তে। বাইরে থেকে বোঝা যাচ্ছে সেটা। হলুদ শর্টসের সামনে থেকে পেছন পর্যন্ত ছড়িয়ে পড়ছে গাঢ় লাল, যেন অবন ঠাকুরের ছোঁয়া। ট্র্যাকের পিচ কালোর ওপর ছড়িয়ে পড়ছে ফোঁটা ফোঁটা রক্ত, যেন দৌড়ানোও এক অপরাধ। কিন্তু সে হাসি মুখে পেটের ক্র্যাম্প অগ্রাহ্য করে করে দৌড়চ্ছে সেই অবস্থাতেই। তার বয়স 17। তার স্যানিটারি প্যাডগুলো টাঙানো আছে গাছে গাছে, বিশ্ববিদ্যালয়ের দেয়ালে দেয়ালে, পার্লামেন্টের নোটিশ বোর্ডে। সে দৌড়চ্ছে ম্যারাথন। গ্যালারি থেকে তার নাম ধরে চিৎকার করতে করতে আনন্দে লাফিয়ে উঠছেন তার বাবা আর মা। ম্যারাথন কে জিতছে কেউ জানে না, কিন্তু অসংখ্য দর্শকের করতালি তার মাসিক রক্তে এসে মিশে যাচ্ছে। আর সে বলছে, দৌড়তে দৌড়তে বলছে, এটা কোনো প্রতিবাদ নয়, কোনো জেহাদ নয়, নারীবাদ নয়, এটা কেবল স্বাভাবিক। এত এত অস্বাভাবিক রক্তপাতের পর এটুকু তোমরা মেনে নেবে না?
I always feel like crying every time I hear you read this.
It's quite an onerous task actually reading Srijato's poem in front of him.
But also reading it in English because it doesn't quite carry that.
Yes, so just forgive me in advance.
No,
Thanks to
thank you for doing
Thanks
it.
to you.
The girl's running the marathon without sanitary pads. She's in the middle of heavy periods. She's running despite them, mile after mile, panting as she runs but with a smile, and the space between her legs has become wet with blood. It's obvious looking at her. A deep red stain has spread across the front and back of her yellow shorts, a touch of Pablo Picasso's paintbrush. Drops of blood are oozing out on the pitch-black running track. As the running too is a crime, but she's running with a smile. Ignoring the cramps in her belly, she's 17. Her sanitary pads have been hung from the trees, from every wall in the university, from the parliament notice board. She's running the marathon. From the gallery, her parents are screaming her name and jumping up and down in joy. No one knows who's won the marathon, but the applause of countless spectators is mingling with the menstrual blood. And she's saying as she runs, this is not a protest, this is not jihad, this isn't feminism. This is merely natural. After so much unnatural bloodshed, are you not going to accept this?
Thank you. So, it's always a little bit hard to come back to a normal discussion after that. But I just wanted to mention that there is a concrete political context to this poem, because there has been discussion, of course, in the media about the whole issue of women not having access to sanitary products, not being able to afford sanitary products. So all of that plays into, when an Indian woman reads this, all of that plays into it. So some of this is translatable because obviously the English carried through. Some of it is clearly not. I have a running battle with a very, what should I say, as somebody who I would describe as a poet senior in Western Australia, one of the doyens of West Australian poetry. And we are constantly thinking about whether poetry is translatable or not. Dennis.
You've been named, Dennis. Shamed by the government, right there.
So there number of things that are really interesting about the translation of the poem. First of all, you didn't use the Bengali word mashik. You used the word period. Is it because mashik is actually still a very dirty word?
No, I have also used mashik. Later on, mashik rakte se korotali mishe jacche.
Oh yes,
So,
mashik. Yeah, but that you've kind of played with it a bit because then it's monthly blood rather than okay. All right, I forgive you. I'm not complaining, but I'm just thinking you chose. And you also chose Obani Thakur.
Obon Thakur.
Obon Thakur je chobi lekhe.
But that was being translated into
As
Pablo Picasso.
Picasso,
Because
that's
Obon
right.
Thakur is
Yeah.
not,
Not
not
known.
very familiar to.
Not at all.
Right,
Not
right.
at all. So, but of course, Obon Thakur means something quite different to the
Definitely.
Bengali than Picasso does.
Yeah.
So, because one of the great phrases about Obon Thakur is Obon Thakur chobi lekhe. He writes paintings. You can tell a whole story. You can tell, you can read a whole song as he through his paintings. So it's a bit of a different. And Rabi, I'm going to put you on the spot as well.
Sure.
Your translator dropped a whole word.
But it's also like it's contextually specific, right? Like they don't even have Stockman in other English-speaking places.
That's right.
Yeah, they don't even have Stockman in Sydney. They tell me. But it's like so.
But it was very
Yeah,
interesting.
but I think in this way, the kind of conceptual point about translation, right, is that the Cicero point, seeing as you brought up Plato, is like there's sense for sense translation and phrase for phrase translation,
Right.
and the translator is caught between those two things. But also the point is that it's like it's not only a repetition or a replication; it's that it's an addition. And so you get now you get a new poem about Pablo Picasso, right? Or you get an old poem about a Stockman. So in that way, I think this kind of, because often I hear it in poetry where it goes like, oh, what is lost in translation? This cliched phrase, or what is found in translation as well. It's like this doubling. There's doubling as well that happens. And like I'm not a translator, but I love speaking with translators because they are very attentive and fine readers. They are as poets. So to put this in context, when Redgate was launched, it sold 26 copies in the first 8 months, and that was me selling that. So we work in very different timescales, Srijato. So you can definitely buy me a beer afterwards, right? And
It's all right. I'll go drink.
so I think in this way, it's like the kind of every reader is a kind of highly valued one, but particularly translators and particularly editors and particularly people who launch your books.
Right.
And this is what I was saying as well about poetry being a participatory community. It's a highly participatory thing where you have to pay attention to the language, but it also means the barrier to entry is lower. It's quite hard to write an 80,000 word novel on your lunch break as opposed to, and so I think in this way the translation ties in with the
and then make people read it.
Yeah.
That's the more difficult part.
Exactly. Yeah, that's right.
So do you then feel, Rabi and then Srijato, do you then feel in translation you are able to speak to that other community in your voice, or do you lose your voice to some extent?
Well, my voice is here, right? And like other people get added to it. And I think for me, like I always feel like so much gratitude actually for any reader, but translators in particular, and readers who come to translators, because some of these people might be reading this for Abhimanyu, not for me, and I feel like a sense of gratitude to that. But I also think like poetry labours under harsh conditions, both political as well as market forces, as well as kind of like the kind of internalized frames of reference. So for me, I just feel like a great sense of gratitude that anyone gets the book, or that that it exists in the world where there is limited space for protest. Or if you have to protest through metaphors, it's like it means you asking the reader to do the work with you in terms of who the target might be. And I think that sense of collaboration beyond participation is really something that translation enables. And for me, I just feel like so much gratitude that someone wants to be in conversation with me or have that udder, and translators are there with you every step of the way. Yeah.
What about your sense when you hear that in English?
Uh,
How much gets across and what doesn't?
You know, there's a very
Because you
interesting.
are you're very trilingual. You're actually equally able to read in 3 languages, and the title of your book is actually not just taking words from Urdu. I don't know, is Darbari because of Darbari Kannada? Is it also taking the language of music?
Right.
So you have also take the language of music.
Yeah.
So when somebody reads it in English, what's lost or what's gained?
I think there's a very interesting saying about translation that translating something is like pouring, perfume from one bottle to another. The amount remains same, but some of the fragrance gets lost in the air. So you have to compromise with it. If you want to carry forward the perfume, you have to sacrifice some of its fragrance. So I think we all are very indebted to translations, because translations are the only bridge between the languages. I couldn't have read Kafka or Marquez or Lorca or Neruda or anyone if translators weren't there.
And how could you be a poet without reading Neruda?
You can't be. So I think translations are very, very, and as Robert said, it's not just a copy. It's like more like a transcreation. He or she also adds something to it to make it a very connectable to the people we are reaching out to. And in English, this after publishing this book in English, I have met new readers who are not furious. So
it's a sibling, not a twin.
Right.
And also this thing about the perfume, it's like, when you're making whiskey, the
Yeah.
part that evaporates are called the angel's shell, right? So it's like that's what it is. It's like
Can I open it up to the room? And we're running a little bit late because these guys arrived a fraction late.
My bad.
And not a problem.
We're running late because we're having a good conversation, Krishna.
That's right. But also because I've just noticed my colleagues gone out to get the pizza for all of us. So I think we'll be coming to an end and moving on to wine and pizza. But until we do, questions from the floor. Yes.
I object to proposition to this. The idea that it goes missing is, and it's contributed to, if it's a protest poem, then the principle behind that protest is really important. The philosophy that underpins why you're so incensed by something going on with justice, that comes across. That's the important part of having the protest in the first place. You may not win that battle, but the principle gets broadcast and becomes the important part of the comment, please.
Yeah. So do either of you want to respond?
I think it says it all, because the philosophy behind the protest is the main thing that the poetry relies on it. And if something's going around you, someone's hurt, someone's killed, and some things are happening which are not very good, and then you are kind of compelled to write poems. You are kind of possessed, and until and unless you write down something to stand against that, you are not feeling fulfilled. I think that urge is the main philosophy behind it. At least to me, I have always written like that.
No, I agree definitely in that. And the thing I would also add is, it depends also in terms of the effectiveness, right? Because we can say the principle or the value might be freedom of expression, but poetry can partly test that. But whether that's the same as lobbying in governments or starting petitions or organising protests or doing the administrative labour or something like PEN International is different. And I think in that way it does two things. One is definitely the principle, but the other thing too is to think about whether the artfulness of the language also has a political effectiveness, as well as by its very mode of expression is a protest. So it's not only what you're saying, but it's how you're saying that. And I think poetry calls attention to that just as much as constitutions and legislations, even if they don't result in material benefits or changes like the Medicare card or like tax breaks for billionaires or whatever it happens to be. And I think in that way, if it's about engaging with power, then you have to think about where things are situated as much as the language itself. Yes.
No.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, look, I'm always fascinated by this idea of creative activism of some sort. But that idea of particularly poetry, it's almost like it's the nourishment that is required to give someone the strength to question or to think and expand their perspective. And I'm really interested in what you said, about how people were so fragile. Because the notion of identity politics has become such a big thing these days that your identity is more important than anything else, the political beliefs, the sort of views of communalism and all of this sort of stuff. So if the poet is challenging that notion of that identity, they're doing their job. I think, and hopefully those people will question, or the people around them will question why they're upset, and that might be the nourishment we need.
Thank you.
Sorry, it's a comment.
Yeah, that's great.
A small question.
Yeah, or a comment. This is another part. So, yeah.
So I have a simple question. All of you know from the discussion it transpired that the poets are not the legislatures of this world. And it transpired also that poetry is an instrument of communication, as you see. But now all of you know that the question is not for three, but all of us, that there is a war in Ukraine. What poets can do, what we can do, what poetry can do. Is there any answer? It's a simple question.
It's not a very simple
question.
Does anybody else want to answer this?
I think on this, like the flip side is also that like legislation is an like unacknowledged poem, right? So like the thing is definitely
not our legislation.
No, but I think the other thing too is like
we're talking about Neruda and
for sure. But
so what kind of protest we can take?
Poetry
against war. Can we make a movement? Can we?
Yeah. I think in that way, poets are not only poets; they write poems. But it's like this is the question about the identity thing. Yes. You can write poems and not be like a poet in a market sense or a political sense or whatever. So I mean, for the most part, lots of poets are citizens too. Like yes, there are poets who are like politicians by day or poets who are sports people. Yeah. So I think in that way, it depends partly on the definition, but I also think it depends on like having the self-care you need for the activism you want to do, right? Because like I've worked with lots of different activists and volunteer organisations, and I myself would like this too, like you get burnt out sometimes or you need a break or you need something like that, and you need a break from writing poems too, like you need to fill the cup. So I think in that way for the Ukraine question is like forces, minds, money are far greater than myself are involved in that. Whereas I prefer the small scale conflicts to think about. I prefer thinking about, like local mining company compensation claims with Yindjibarndi people in the Pilbara. I like thinking about Noongar native title settlement. I like thinking about deaths in custody in Western Australia.
They're all big questions.
They're big questions too, but they're not Ukraine, And I think in that way all politics like benefits from local activism.
Srijato, I just wondered whether you actually wanted to respond to the earlier question about identity politics, but I think Dennis has a question.
Comment on, Ukraine poetry really matters at the moment because that's such an emotionally intense thing, and in a kind of small scale way the same thing happens. People who don't read poetry in our society and societies like ours turn to it and use it at weddings and funerals, deeply emotional times. But I think the unacknowledged, but certainly poets are unacknowledged, but we think and we talk using language. Even people who write, if you do music criticism or art criticism, you do it using language.
No one does literary criticism doing a dance. So poetry, one of poetry's roles is to keep the quality of the language alive. And this is a sort of very indirect way in which, but of all the kind of uses of language, poetry is the one which uses language's resources the most fully. And it's precisely for that reason you can't get the translation right. And in translation, I know anyone who's worked with translators will know they are particular readers. I mean, they're unique, I think. And they will ask, I know I've been translating, they ask you questions and you think, I never thought about that. But they have a kind of exactitude and they put everything into their conscious minds, whereas so much of the work done, including by the writer, is done with the unconscious mind. And a lot of, translation theory, when you get down to it, all the kind of volumes written, you can do 4 years of study of translation theory, but it all comes down to what John Dryden said in the 1700s. You either go for the exact meanings, or you go for the spirit of what was written. And obviously you end up somewhere between the two. But in poetry, of all the things you might translate, you have to go for the spirit of it.
Right.
Because the texture of the languages is going to be so different. And it's easy enough to get the meaning the way Steve talked about, but that doesn't give you the poem as the poem. The poem in English is a different thing to the poem in Bengali. And I'm sorry, Srijato, you can check that out.
Okay.
So, you're going to respond to either that or the identity politics question?
No. I think those are more like comments and opinions, which I also stand for. So they also speak for me.
So, yes.
I just wanted to make a point about, really Dennis actually made it for me, about the spirit of a poem that doesn't get lost in translation, because I grew up a working class Dublin girl and I was, very aware of period shaming and even the fact that you wrote that poem. I can imagine us as teenage girls in Dublin in the 80s read from the head up because we couldn't say it, it wasn't said. And when you would go and get feminine hygiene products in the local pharmacy, they would stuff them in the brown paper bag and slide them across the counter in case the man behind you in the queue saw you. And for the translation issue, I had tears in my eyes, and I'm an ex-marathon runner, and I had that vision of the Boston Marathon where they pulled the woman out of the marathon. And they didn't want to let her finish, because she went in pretending she was a male, and I think it was only in the 70s. And then other men actually allowed her to finish, and she was the first woman to run the marathon, and then women started running marathons again. And for me, I was sitting here, and it was also symbolic, of what you were so eloquently did in your poem. And I thought, the translation captured it, Here I am in Dublin in the 80s, having this experience of being a woman with my body, and being ashamed and embarrassed, and it just moved me, and I thought, wow, it's
praise to the translator
there, of the message. The translation is
thank you. Our point is proven.
Your point, so great translation and a great piece of poetry. I'm thinking, I don't think the pizza has arrived yet because I can't smell it. But unless other people have... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
She has
oh, sorry, go ahead.
I actually have a question about language. The India that I grew up in, we borrowed words from other languages if they didn't fit what we needed to. Being multilingual was a fact of life. So, Srijato, I want to know... is there a push for the purity of language now? Particularly with a right-wing Hindu nationalist Prime Minister who doesn't want the word said mehfil, which is what this is, to be used.
I have been fortunate enough to include all kinds of words in my poetry from the very beginning. There was huge push from the readers against the English words I used. Why are you using so much of English words? Because I told them, because in a day's life I myself use those, so I can't be a different person while I sit on at the table writing poetry, and a different person in the other hours of the day. And nowadays it's a narrow kind of a thing, using Urdu words are being seen in a different kind of vision. But fortunately my readers are not like that. The ardent readers who read poetry, they are very open-minded. And as Bengali, especially Bengali, is a language which has kept borrowing words from every other language, and it has expanded itself to a great language by borrowing. It has its own treasure and it keeps borrowing. So I think Bengali has its own elasticity, and it can it can accommodate the words and phrases from different languages. And nowadays the poets in Bengal, they try to assimilate the essence of other languages too into Bengali poetry. So we are right now a kind of at a fortunate slide to not have such push, but what you have mentioned, the push from the right-wing side, the right-wing people against few languages or words, those are there, but not in Bengali especially. We are very fortunate not to have that.
Yeah, and kind of I think on that kind of related point too, is I think definitely thinking about English being an Indian language.
English is definitely an
You know what I
Indian
mean?
language.
Like in the sense of like the kind of, it's not only borrowing words, it's like borrowing, retrofitting, changing, all those kind of things. So Indian English has a sibling of English, but also rooted in the subcontinent reality experience ground exists, right? And I think in that way, translation is kind of one concept to think through, but definitely collaboration, borrowing, and I think in that way, political language is striking, not only for its desire to be sealed, but also in just how cliched it is in its search for sound bites, right? Like it's like the kind of like sound bitten quality of like political language almost everywhere. The kind of like cliched phrases that get trotted out or through focus groups, the kind of really inauthentic, unnatural quality of political language is actually really striking, that I think poetry is somehow opposed to implicitly and explicitly in a whole range of Englishes and Bengali as well.
Interesting. It just made me think about something. With some words we know are from coming to English as part of the whole colonial English. The word curry isn't English, the word coolie isn't English. Shampoo isn't English. But the one that I just thought about that fascinates me is juggernaut.
Sure.
Juggernaut is in fact Jagannath.
Juggernaut is it's an extraordinary word. We never think it's not an English word.
Right. And pajama.
Well, like so in fact, you're right. These are siblings that grew up together, and English is definitely. So yes. Should we? Oh, sorry. I was just going to say we can start having a little drink, but I'm not sure what's happening.
Pizzas.
I can't smell the pizzas. It's interesting.
I wanted to know whether the response to your work and the threats made against you, how does that? Do you think it's hard to say, but do you think that has had effect on the way you're thinking about writing in the future? Or has it just inspired you to go even further?
Very good question, thank you. I think it hasn't affected my writing, but it has affected the thought that where should I publish it? Or should I even publish it? Or should I put it on the social media? Because I have been very cautious about it from that day, that I knew that everything is not to be shared on the social media, and everyone sitting behind it is not an ardent reader or a a lover of poetry. So I am a bit skeptical and cautious about publishing them or putting them on social media, but I haven't stopped writing them. I publish them as books, which a few people only read. So the internet connection is everything we have to be very careful about, not the printed version, I think.
Yeah, and the internet connection is on platforms
Yeah.
that are compromised. So, literature in Australia, a lot of it now for a contemporary generation happens on Twitter, and it's that's a flashpoint right now. It's not even on Mastodon or some other platforms which are something else.
Shall we draw the sitting around to an end, and I will transform myself from having been a moderator to bartender.
A participatory model.
Very immoderate person, as you've always known, Robbie. So, if there are no other formal questions here, perhaps we can move on to having a glass of wine. But I wanted to say thank you. This is a bit of a Indian-style family affair in some way. One is the Wood family, who are our hosts. We've got a few of them in the room. And Caroline isn't here. It's mainly a thank you to Caroline, but also to you, Robbie, for making the space available and being here. And of course, the Banerjee family, who are here in force and who are Srijato's hosts, who have organised for this to happen. And Srijato, thank you very much.
Thanks to you
and
too.
I hope you will
Pleasure.
all stay and join us for a glass of wine and the pizzas when they arrive. Thank you.